Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Tennessee.
I'm delighted to hear the senator from Delaware, my friend, discuss some aspects of President Bush's time there that aren't as well remembered, including his amendments to the Clean Air Act, on which the senator from Delaware and I have worked. In June of 1992, President George Herbert Walker Bush and his wife, Barbara, were walking across the South Lawn on a hot, sunny day to make a major announcement about school choice. And Barbara turned to the president and said, "George, you've got on the wrong pants." And the president of the United States turned around, walked back in the White House, changed his suit into the proper suit, and came back out and made an announcement, one of the biggest of his time as president, to ask the Congress to provide $500 million to states and cities like Milwaukee and Wisconsin who wanted to give low-income families choices of better schools for their children. Before that, I can recall a 3 p.m. or so meeting on January 17, 1991. The meeting was about educational assessment, a very dull subject. And the president had called it in the cabinet room. Governor Harper will remember educational assessment from his days as governor. And the meeting went on, and the president got up and left and came back after about 10 minutes. The rest of us thought very little about it. Turned out later we found out that he was calling Gorbachev in the Soviet Union to let him know in advance that the United States was about to start bombing Baghdad about 5:30 that afternoon, U.S. time. And he had constructed and put on the public schedule that meeting on educational assessment so that the world wouldn't know what was about to happen. A few weeks later, we were having lunch, and he was mulling over the prospect of putting 1 million American military men and women on the ground in the Middle East in the first Gulf War. He had a special feeling of that because of his background as a combat pilot in World War II. And he knew what it meant to risk even one American life in that exercise. All of us have been having memories and stories we could tell about the president, but I want to talk about 3 aspects of his service very briefly. 1 is gentleman, 2 is well prepared, and 3 is pioneer especially in education. I've suggested to John Meacham, the extraordinary biographer of President George H.W. Bush, that a better title for his book might be The Last Gentleman. Now, saying that to an author is kind of like saying you ought to rename your baby something else. That's not a very prudent thing to say. And I hope it's not true that he is the last gentleman, but his temperament and conduct, winning while he won and while he lost, in war and in peace, with adversaries and friends, reminds us that you can be tough, that you can win the presidency, that you can be a combat pilot in a world war, and you can still treat others with respect, which he unfailingly did. And I was thinking that last night as we stood outside on the steps and watched the casket being brought up, that in a beautiful evening, the sunset, looking out over the Library of Congress, looking out over the Supreme Court, I was thinking that with all the rancor we sometimes have here as we work out difficult problems, we're pretty lucky to live in this country. We're pretty lucky to have this form of government we have, and we're extraordinarily fortunate that we can produce men and women like George H.W. Bush who bring out the best in us. Which leads me to my second point, what I think of when I think of our former president, and those are the words, well prepared. Now, we've had lots of different kinds of presidents of the United States with varying backgrounds, and many have been successful, and it's hard to say exactly what will make a president successful. I actually think temperament has more to do with it than anything else. But what we had in President George H.W. Bush may have been the best prepared president in our history. congressman, candidate for the Senate, head of his national political party, the first ambassador, in effect, to Japan, head of the United Nations, vice president of the United States, head of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, if you're going to put somebody through a training course, a boot camp, in order to be president of the United States, that's what you would do. You would take someone of extraordinary intellect, someone who might have graduated in 3 years, Phi Beta Kappa from Yale, extraordinary courage, someone who'd fly combat, the youngest aviator in World War II. You'd put them through that boot camp and you'd say, now you're the president of the United States. And I thought how fortunate we were that he happened to be the one who came along then. Because the things that he accomplished in his 4 years, or the things that he presided over, or the things that he led us to do as a country weren't that easy, weren't that easy. I mean, take the disintegration of the Soviet Union. That's a very dangerous situation. They have a lot of nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union, and a history of antagonism toward much of Europe and the United States. But President Bush, because of his temperament and his skill and the extraordinary team he had around him, presided over that in a way that allowed Mr. Gorbachev and the Soviet Union to really come apart. It could have easily gone another direction. Or the reunification of Germany. You can be sure that France was skeptical about the reunification of Germany. Wouldn't you be as well if you'd been involved in two World War IIs in that century with Germany? Margaret Thatcher was opposed to the reunification of Germany quietly, according to Vice President Quayle, who should know about such things. And Mr. Kohl from Germany was for it. So our president had to know those individuals well enough and be adept enough to preside over the reunification of Germany and the disintegration of the Soviet Union at the same time. Balancing the budget, that wasn't popular within the Republican Party. When you look at the portraits of the presidents of the White House, you often think of what did that president do that went beyond his base, that his original supporters might not have agreed with, but that put the country first. You look at Nixon, you think China. You look at Reagan, you think the Berlin Wall. And you look at George Bush and you think a number of things, but one of the things he did was balance the budget in a way that most Republicans didn't like. He paid a price for it when he ran for re-election. But the country and President Clinton during the 1990s benefited greatly from that fact. And then, as Senator Carper pointed out, he led the amendments of the Clean Air Act. I was in East Tennessee these last few weeks. We like the fact that you could see the Great Smoky Mountains, and they're not the Great Smoggy Mountains anymore. And the reason that's true is because of the Clean Air Act, more than anything else, which has required coal plants when they operate to put pollution control equipment on them. They can still operate. There's nothing to keep a coal plant from operating in this country as long as you put pollution control equipment for mercury, nitrogen, and sulfur on it, and then they can be perfectly clean. That doesn't include carbon, but carbon you can't see, and we like to see the mountains. And the decisions that were made that had to do with exhaust from trucks and cars. So America is healthier, cleaner, and we can attract businesses to our state now that our air is clean, because before that was a problem. And the Americans for Disabilities Act, that was a difficult law to pass, and a difficult law for many parts of our country to accept and frankly pay for. But think of the lives that it has changed. No one could have passed that who wasn't well prepared for the presidency. So as I think of President Bush, I think first of a gentleman, second, well prepared, and then finally, pioneer in education. Most of the time when we think of this President Bush, we think of his skills in foreign policy because they were considerable and the challenges were great. For example, I didn't mention the Gulf War a moment ago. Well, I did in a couple of cases, but I didn't mention the fact of putting 1 million troops on the ground, getting the rest of the world to pay for most of the war, and then deciding not to go into Baghdad and get mired down there. Those are decisions that a skilled, well-prepared man would do. He was also a pioneer in education, and that is where I'd like to talk about. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush assembled all the nation's governors in Charlottesville to talk about education. Terry Branstad, the current ambassador to China, was then the chairman of the governors. And out of that summit came national education goals, that every child by the year 2000 would learn math, science, history, and geography in a proficient way. Then with America 2000, in the last 2 years of his term, I was education secretary then, he launched America 2000. That was to help states and communities reach those national education goals, state by state, community by community. So we had Nebraska 2000 and Nashville 2000 as Democrats and Republicans sought to do that. The importance of it was that President George H.W. Bush understood that to have lasting reform in education, it has to be owned by the state. It has to be owned by the community. We saw that, for example, in the recent exercise on Common Core standards. Common Core really was developed by the governors. It was moving through the country, state by state by state, and then when the federal government mandated it in effect, there was a great rebellion because there wasn't any buy-in, because there wasn't buy-in. The same with teacher evaluation. I led a fight in Tennessee to evaluate Tennessee teachers, the hardest thing I was ever involved in, great big fight with the National Education Association. But we did it, and 10,000 teachers went up the career ladder. They bought into it. When you order it from Washington, they don't buy into it, and President Bush understood that. So with his national education goals, his voluntary national standards, his voluntary national tests, they were all voluntary. They were not imposed from Washington, D.C. He created an environment through America 2000 where states and cities and communities could adopt them, and they were lasting. Most of the steps that states, including my state of Tennessee, have taken to make schools better in the last 30 years were either started by or encouraged by George H.W. Bush since the National Governors Summit in 1989. And that includes charter schools. In 1991 and 92, President Bush encouraged every community to create start-from-scratch schools, he called them. And many did. He created a New American Schools Development Corporation with the help of Deputy Education Secretary David Kearns, raised about $70 million and gave grants to that. My last act as Education Secretary for President Bush was to write every school superintendent and say, why don't you try one of these new charter schools that the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party has created? There were only 10 at the time. That was 1992. Those start-from-scratch schools suggested by President George H.W. Bush are now 5,000 charter schools in the country, or about 5% of all the public schools in America. And then school choice. I began with a story of his walking across the South Lawn to announce the GI Bill for kids, to give money to states and districts to encourage school choice. The Democratic Congress at the time didn't appropriate the dollars he asked for start-from-scratch schools, and they didn't appropriate the money for school choice, but his advocacy, his persistent advocacy using the bully pulpit, gave us national goals, national standards, national tests, accountability systems, school choice, charter schools, all of that. And the difference was that he insisted that we not have a national school board in the process. His successors all tended to have Washington edicts. President Clinton, President George W. Bush, President Obama. I can understand why they felt that way. They were eager to see results, and so they thought, let Washington order Texas and Tennessee and Wisconsin to do it. But unfortunately, that backfires. That backfired on Common Core, it backfired on teacher evaluation, but as soon as we stepped back and used advocacy instead of edicts, as President H.W. Bush understood, we got a more lasting result. So he was well prepared, he was a gentleman, he was a pioneer in education. Some people are suggesting he may be the most effective one-term president in our history. He could very well be. You add it all up, the Gulf War handled like it was, the reunification of Germany, the successful disintegration of the Soviet Union, the Clean Air laws, the Americans for Disabilities Act, pioneering in education with America 2000, balancing the budget. That's a lot to do in 4 years. Maybe James K. Polk is the only one I can think of that might give him a good run for his money in terms of that accolade. I remember when the Gulf War was over and President Bush came to speak to the Congress. And I'll close with this. It was the first time I'd had a chance to sit and listen to a presidential address as a member of the cabinet. And I remember thinking, after that wonderful victory, so well done, 1 million men on the ground and women, very few casualties. The rest of the world paid for most of the war. We avoided going into Baghdad, a very successful operation. The president's approval rating was at 91%. I remember thinking, I wish he would say, now that we have won the war, let's turn our attention to home and apply the same sort of energy to America 2000 and make America 2000 his entire domestic program. Perhaps it would have been difficult for Bill Clinton to defeat him that year if that had been his domestic agenda. No one will ever know, but what we do know, he was a gentleman. He was as well prepared as any president in history for the job. He served at a time when we needed that preparation because the challenges were immense. He was a pioneer in education, and he may have been the most successful one-term president in history, a man who put the country first and whom we all admire, George H.W. Bush. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.